Chapter 3 of Tractate Nazir goes through further laws on the Nazarite vow. The first Mishnah says, if somebody vows to be a Nazir, he cuts his hair on the 31st day after, but it's still valid if he cuts his hair on the 30th day. If somebody says he's a Nazir for 30 days, it's not valid to cut his hair on the 30th day. If somebody vowed for 2 consecutive Nazarite terms, he cuts his hair on the 31st and 61st day. If he cuts his hair on day 30, he must cut his hair again on day 60. If he cuts his hair on day 59, that's valid, as the 30th day of the first term can also count as a part of the second term. If somebody vowed to be a Nazir and becomes impure on the 30th day, some say the whole term is forfeit, some say he forfeits only 7 days. If somebody says he's a Nazir for 30 days and becomes impure on the 30th day, it's agreed that his whole term is forfeit. If somebody vowed to become a Nazir for 100 days and becomes impure on day 100, some say he forfeits his entire period, some say only 30 days. If he becomes impure on day 101, some say he forfeits 30 days, some say only 7. The Gemara explains, in the case where he says he's a Nazir and becomes impure on day 30, the opinion that says he forfeits 7 days, it's because he holds it occurs after the completion of his term. When he specifies 30 days, that meant 30 whole days, so he'd need to redo the whole term. This is relevant in regards to the earlier debate if the minimum Nazarite period is 30 or 29 days. New Mishnah, somebody who declares himself a Nazir while in a cemetery, even if he's there for 30 days, they don't count towards his Nazarite term, and he doesn't bring the offering for becoming impure. If he left and went back in, it is a part of his term, and he would bring an offering for impurity. Others say that this won't apply on the first day, as based on the verse, there's no forfeiting a Nazarite vow until you've done a few days. The Gemara says, it's actually debated if somebody takes a Nazarite vow in a cemetery, if it takes effect based on whether the vow could be held in stasis until after he leaves the cemetery or not. It's debated. We bring a source which proves you actually can become a Nazir while impure. So rather, both opinions agree that a Nazarite vow while impure takes effect immediately. The dispute is whether they receive lashes for this violation, which is debated. We bring a source which clearly says he would receive lashes. There are additional unresolved questions on some specific cases. Further, if somebody becomes a Nazir while in a cemetery, it's debated if he needs to cut his hair based on whether the hair cutting is only required on a pure Nazir who becomes impure or even on a Nazir who started impure. This is for the discussed. We bring a source which says he would not need to cut his hair in such a situation, although it depends on the opinion held by these points. There's additional discussion on these cases. Essentially, there are a number of opinions as to what to do if the Nazarite term was interrupted with impurity. Some say the count is restarted right after he repurifies himself with immersion and sprinkling on the 7th day of purity. Some say the count is restarted after the 8th day, even without sacrifices being offered. Some say the count is renewed on the 8th day, but requires the bringing of the Chattas offering. And some say on the 8th day, and after he brings both the Chattas and Asham offerings. We bring a source which appears to differentiate between a Chattas sin offering and an Olah offering, and that's explained to be like the opinion that a Nazir must always bring a Chattas offering after, whether he's pure or impure, as he's considered to be a sinner. In the case where he left the cemetery and came back in, some explain this to mean that he left sprinkled on the 3rd day, re-sprinkled, and immersed on the 7th day, and even if he re-enters the cemetery after on the 7th, it's included in the count. The other opinions are also qualified. They are discussed further, along with sources. New Mishnah. If somebody vowed to become a Nazir for a long while outside of Israel, and completed it, and then went into Israel, the Shammai says he must become a Nazir for 30 days. The Rabbi Hillel says he must redo his full term. There's an incident where the Queen Helena of Adiabene, a convert to Judaism whose son went to war, so she vowed to become a Nazir for 7 years if he returned safely, and he did, but she did her Nazarite term outside of Israel, and when she arrived in Israel, Hillel ruled she had to redo her whole period. So she did, and at the very end, she became impure, so it was ruled that she had to do it again, meaning she did 21 years total. Some say she was only a Nazir for 14 years, though. The Gemara explains the dispute if the person outside of Israel needs to redo their Nazarite period fully, that they both agree that the land outside of Israel is impure, not the air. The debate is in regards to the penalty, if it's a 30-day term or a redoing of the full term. In regards to the opinion that the Queen Helena was a Nazir for 14 years, the implication is that this version disagrees that she became impure, as if she had, and it was like the opinion that she would only need to redo 30 days, it would have said she had done a total of 14 years and 30 days. New Mishnah. If there are 2 sets of witnesses on somebody's Nazir vow, one set said he declared 2 Nazarite terms and the other said he declared 5 terms. Beis Shammai says they're contradicting each other, so there is no Nazarite vow. Beis Hillel says the testimony of the 2 terms is included in the 5 terms. So he must do the 2 terms. The Gemara says, others say that actually the dispute is that they agree in this case that 2 is included in 5. What they debate over is if there's only 1 witness for both. Beis Shammai says there's no Nazir period. Beis Hillel says 2 is included in 5. Some say if 1 witness testifies that he said 1 and 2, and the other says 3, 4, 5. Their testimony is split, and he has no Nazarite period. Others disagree. And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Nazir continues discussing the laws of the Nazarite vow. The first Mishnah says, if somebody says that he's a Nazir, and another person says, and I, and a third person says, and I, they all become a Nazir. If the first one is released of his vow, they all are released of their vows. If the last one is released of his vow, it's only him. If somebody declared himself as a Nazir and a second person says, my mouth is like his mouth, or my hair is like his hair, the second person is also a Nazir. If somebody declared himself as a Nazir and his wife says, and I, the husband can revoke her vow while leaving his still in place. If she said that she's a Nazir and he said, and I, he can't revoke her vow. If a man said, I am a Nazir and you, and his wife said, amen, he can revoke her vow while leaving his own in place. If she said, I am a Nazir and you, and he said, amen, he can't revoke her vow. The Gemara says, an opinion that the only way saying, and I, to include yourself in a Nazarite vow, that this works is if it's said within the time it takes to make an utterance, which is defined as the length of time it takes for a student to greet his teacher. Others disagree and they debate proofs. When a sequence of people said, and I, it debates if their and I refers to the prior guy or to the original guy. This is practically relevant, as if it's to the prior guy, they can keep making new links, and if it's to the original guy, they can only make their vows within the time period of the first guy. This is debated from a number of sources. We bring a source which says, if the first person is released from his vow, all of the others are also. If the last one is released from his vow, it's only him, and if the middle one is released from his vow, all the ones coming after are released from their vows, which proves that it does function in a chain language. Some clarify the case where he said about his mouth or hair to be where he said, let my mouth be like his mouth in regards to refraining from wine, or like his hair in regards to not cutting it. In regards to the husband vowing to be a Nazir and his wife saying, and I, and the husband revoking the vow, it debates if it fully retroactively nullifies the vow, or if it just stops it right there. This is practically relevant if somebody else said, and I, to the wife's vow. A number of proofs are suggested and disproven. After additional cases, we bring one which says, in that practically brought case, the second woman's vow stays, implying the wife's vow is only ended right there. Some say, if the second woman had said, I am like you, her vow would also be revoked. There's additional discussion. It asks, what if the second woman had said, I am a Nazir in your footsteps, or I am in your footsteps, or similar, whether their vows are now linked. So if the wife's vow is revoked, hers would also be. It's debated. In regards to the wife saying amen to his saying if she's partaking in it, there's a different source which seems to imply he can't nullify her vow, unlike what we said. So some amend the text to say that he can annul her vow. Some say that actually the case is where he said, I am a Nazir and you, as a statement, not a question, as our case was. New Mishnah. If a woman vowed to be a Nazir and then intentionally drinks wine or becomes impure, she receives the penalty of 40 lashes. If her husband revoked her vow, even if she didn't realize, she doesn't receive the lashes. Some say she does for rebelliousness. The Gemara cites verses as sources for these points. It also generally discusses some further points on how the intent behind an action changes how it's perceived. As an example, two people who bring a paschal offering, one to eat in a gluttonous manner, and others to fulfill the commandment, exemplifying the verse, for the roads of God are straight, the righteous walk in them, while the transgressors stumble in them. Others say it's more accurately exemplified with other instances, the point on Lot and his daughters after surviving Sodom and Gomorrah cohabiting, the daughters doing so to try and do a right thing to restart the human race, Lot doing so as a sin, as he allowed it to happen twice. There are further points on Lot and discussion on other similar instances of scriptural immoral relations, for instance Tamar, who did so but with good intent, so kings and prophets were descended from her, unlike Zimri, who did so for improper intents and tens of thousands died due to him. Some even say a transgression performed for the sake of heaven is greater than a good deed done for ulterior motives, and it brings related verses. Famously, it says, a person should still learn Torah and do mitzvahs even if it's done with the wrong motives, as through this you'll eventually come to do it for the right reasons. It discusses additional points on the incident with Lot. New Mishnah. If a woman made a Nazarite vow and consecrated an animal for the sacrifice at the end of her term, and then the husband revoked the vow, if the animal belonged to the husband, it goes back to being unconsecrated. If the animal was the woman's, if it was consecrated as a chatas offering, it's left to die. If it was consecrated as an olah offering, it's offered as a voluntary olah. If it's a shlamim, it's offered as a voluntary shlamim, which can be eaten for one day, and it does not require the bread offering like it typically does with the Nazir's shlamim offering. If there was money set aside for the offering, but it was unspecified, it goes for the voluntary communal offering. If she had specified funds, the money for a chatas offering is thrown into the Dead Sea. It can't be benefited from, but it is not me'ilah, the prohibition against benefiting from consecrated property, which won't apply here. If the money is for an olah offering, they use it to bring a voluntary olah, and it is forbidden with me'ilah to use it, with the money being for a shlamim offering, is used to bring a voluntary shlamim, which is eaten for one day and does not require the typical bread offerings. The Gemara says, this was cited like the opinion that holds a husband is not obligated to supply the offerings for his wife's Nazarite service, which is a debated point. It also asks where the wife has her own property that's not shared by the husband, which is suggested that she either saved up for it with leftovers of her allotted food, or they were given to her as a gift on condition that her husband doesn't have rights to them. There are further points on the offerings. The points on specific funds are discussed further. There are additional points on this. It also defines as to what sort of declarations of your funds towards offerings constitute the creation of a specified fund. These phrases are qualified, and it lists some things that can't be treated as an unspecified fund as they aren't considered to be money, such as an ingot of metal. Others say it is legally money, but a stack of buildings would not be one. The logic of these opinions are debated. Some state that a blemished animal can constitute an unblemished fund as its value is of money, which is discussed. It cites a lengthy source which seems to disagree with the opinion that blemished animals are considered as unspecified funds by these laws. After citing the whole source, it again essentially explains that it's referring to blemished animals whose value is that of money, hence why they fall into the category of unspecified funds. New Mishnah. If during the wife's conclusion of her Nazarite term ceremony the blood of her offering was being sprinkled on the altar, the husband can no longer revoke her Nazarite vow. Some say he can't if one of the animals was slaughtered and they haven't yet sprinkled the blood on the temple altar. This applies if she was pure at the end of her Nazarite service. If she was not, he can revoke her vow after the offerings have been brought, as he can say he doesn't want her Nazarite service to have to restart, which it will. Others say he can revoke her vow even if she's pure during the service, as he can say he doesn't want his wife to cut her hair. The Gemara explains that this disagrees with the opinion that the woman's Nazarite service ends only when she's done every single concluding service, including cutting her hair, as the husband wouldn't be able to revoke her vow then at that point. Our Mishnah holds that her service is completed once the blood is sprinkled. The opinion which says he can't if they've even sacrificed the animal says this because it would be a waste of consecrated items. This would apply to the Chata's sin offering being done first, as the other offerings' blood can still be used. The dispute as to if you can revoke the vow because you don't want her hair to be cut is based on if people are okay with wigs or not. New Mishnah. A man can declare his son a Nazir, but a woman cannot declare her son to be a Nazir. If the son refused his father's declaration by cutting his hair or verbally protesting, or his relatives had done this and the father had consecrated animals for the service, the Chatas offering would be left to die. The Ola is brought as a voluntary Ola, and the Shalomim is brought as a voluntary Shalomim, which can be eaten for one night without the bread offering. If it was an unspecified fund that was set aside, it goes to voluntary offerings. If it was specified towards offerings, the Chatas money gets thrown into the Dead Sea. It can't be benefited from, but Me'ilah, the prohibition against using consecrated temple property, does not apply. The Ola funds would be used to buy a voluntary Ola offering, and there's Me'ilah for its misuse, and the Shlamim funds are used to buy a voluntary Shlamim offering, which can be eaten for one day, and it is not brought with the bread offering. The Gemara says the reason a mother cannot designate her son as a Nazir is either it's just a tradition passed down from Mount Sinai, or because it was enacted to help her father teach his son the observation of the Torah law, which is an obligation only for the father to a son. It's explained that this would apply to vows or even the Nazarite vow. The issue with the relatives, according to this, is that if the relatives don't approve, presumably the child wouldn't either. According to this opinion that it's not a tradition and it's only rabbinic, it's able to override the prohibition against shaving your whole head, as he holds that that's also a rabbinic institution. Furthermore, as this is basically being done for education, according to this, he's allowed to bring unconsecrated animals into the temple courtyard, as he holds the prohibition against that is not scriptural, and neither is there a scriptural law for the slaughtering requirement for birds, which is why the bird offerings are allowed here, even though they aren't slaughtered typically. There are further points. These opinions are debated in regards to the ages of the sons as to where such a vow would be permissible based on related discussions. There are additional points. New Mishnah. If a father and his child are both a Nazir, but the father sets aside unspecified funds for the offerings, and then he dies, his Nazir son can use them for his offerings, but his daughter cannot. Others say the funds must go to voluntary offerings, and a son can use his father's funds if he became a Nazir only on condition that he can use his father's funds for the conclusion offerings. The Gemara says that a daughter can't use her father's funds. That's a tradition, again, passed down from Mount Sinai, and is relevant when he only has a daughter, so there's no son to inherit before her. It's explained that the two opinions of the Mishnah argue. The first saying the son can use the funds even if it wasn't conditional, and he was a Nazir from before. It also asks, what if there are two sons, whether it goes to the first one who finishes, or if they split it, or what if one was a firstborn, does he get priority like by typical inheritance laws? It also asks if there's variation if the father and son were different types of Nazirs, one being permanent and the other being a typical Nazir and others, and they all go unresolved. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Tractate Nazir continues going through the laws of the Nazarite vow. The first Mishnah says, Beis Shammai holds that accidental consecration is still valid consecration. Beis Hillel disagrees. For instance, they'd argue if somebody said, referring to his black ox, that the first thing that comes out of his house will be consecrated, and his white ox walks out first, or in reference to a gold dinar, he said he'd consecrate the first coin he draws out of his hand, and he draws out a silver one, or he said, in reference to a barrel of wine, the first of which comes to my hand will be consecrated, and he gets a barrel of oil first. Beis Shammai would say all of those cause the item to still be consecrated. Beis Hillel would say it's not. The Gemara explains the logic of these opinions. Beis Shammai says an accidental consecration is valid, as these laws of primary consecrations are learnt from derivative consecration, which take effect even when done accidentally. Beis Hillel would disagree. The validity of this comparison is debated from a few sources. Some based on these laws adjust the case, for instance with the ox to be where he only found out about the mistaken consecration on the incorrect animal after the fact in the afternoon, and it says he wouldn't have made the consecration if he knew it would apply to that animal. The grammar of the Mishnah is therefore adjusted accordingly. It also debates the preference of different colored oxen for different tasks. In the Mishnah, if somebody vowed to be a Nazir and he violated this by drinking wine, and then he asked the sage to revoke his vow, and the sage said it was legally binding, he counts from the time that he vowed. If the sage had released the vow, if he had designated an animal for the offering, it's no longer consecrated. Beis Hillel argues with Beis Shammai over this, saying that this is a case of accidental consecration. Beis Shammai cites a case of miscounting animal tithes, where all the animals are still consecrated in spite of being counted incorrectly. Beis Hillel rejects this, as he says they're consecrated by scriptural decree, not based on his counting. The Gemara cites the opinion source for this Mishnah and further explains the dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai in regards to this and by miscounting tithes. New Mishnah, if somebody vowed to be a Nazir, he went to bring his animal and he found it was stolen. If he declared himself to be a Nazir before it was stolen, he is a Nazir. If it was after, he is not. It cites an instance of something like this occurring where a sage had declared himself a Nazir unknowing that the temple had been destroyed. He found out and it was annulled, but some said the annulment was based on whether he had vowed before or after the temple was destroyed. The Gemara clarifies these opinions and says the latter opinion would allow the annulment of the vow based on an unexpected occurrence. The destruction of the temple is deemed to be unexpected, in spite of there being pretty clear scriptural reference to it occurring, even down to referencing the exact year that it would happen, but they didn't know the exact day it would be destroyed, so it was said to be unexpected. New Mishnah, if there were 6 people walking and they see somebody walking, and the first one says, I'm a Nazir, if it's a particular person. The second man says, I'm a Nazir, if it's not that particular person. The third says, I'm a Nazir, if one of you are a Nazir. The fourth says, I'm a Nazir if one of you are not a Nazir. The fifth says, I'm a Nazir if the first 2 are both Nazirim, which isn't really possible. And the sixth man says he's a Nazir if all 5 people are a Nazir. Beis Shammai says they're all Nazirim, as it's similar to accidental consecration. Beis Hillel says the one whose condition is not fulfilled is a Nazir, which will be explained. Rav Tarfon says that none of them are a Nazir. If the approaching man turns around and they never find out who it was, some say none of them are a Nazir, others say the vower should say, if I was correct, I'm a Nazir. If I was not correct, I'm a voluntary Nazir anyways, to be safe. The Gemara says, Beis Hillel says, the one whose condition is not fulfilled is a Nazir. Some say this is a mistake, and it should read the one whose condition is fulfilled is a Nazir. Some say it means he's a Nazir if his later words are fulfilled. In the event that they did see the man, it debates his opinion by these laws. It would imply that he's definitely not a Nazir, unlike the last opinion, who says that he's a Nazir out of doubt. New Mishnah, if somebody sees a specific animal that there's a question if it's a wild or domesticated animal, and one person said he's a Nazir if that's a wild animal, person 2 says he's a Nazir if it's not a wild animal, person 3 said he's a Nazir if it's a domestic animal, person 4 says he's a Nazir that it's not a domestic animal. Person 5 says he's a Nazir if it's a wild and domestic animal. Person 6 says he's a Nazir if it's neither a wild or domestic animal. Person 7 said to person 1 through 6 that he's a Nazir if one of you is a Nazir. Person 8 said to 1 through 6 that he's a Nazir if none of them are a Nazir. And person 9 said to people 1 through 6 that he's a Nazir if all of them are a Nazir. Then in this case, all of them would be a Nazir. The Gemara cites a source where someone could take upon himself 9 terms of Naziris by a 10th person seeing this whole thing, saying he's a Nazir, and taking upon the Naziris of all of them. And that's the end of chapter 5.